Hello, my name is Jan Servaes and welcome to Encounters. My guest today is David Bollier. David is a local living in Amherst, but he is, so to speak, world famous, and world famous for a specific reason. He is one of the 3 or 4, maybe 5 people who are connected to what is being called in our community the Creative Commons, the movement towards the Creative Commons. He will, of course, explain what this is all about. David is a writer. He writes quite prolific books. He is a blogger. He has his own blogs. On the Commons is one of those websites which I would recommend to go to. He's of course also an activist and involved in that movement towards the Creative Commons. And 2 milestones or 2 important activities which took place this year, which have quite a bit of importance for the future of this movement, are the Charter for Innovation, Creativity and Access to Knowledge, which has been accepted and adopted at the Barcelona conference in May this year. And also important is a conference David just returned from, which was held in Berlin, the International Creative Commons Conference. I assume that you're going to say a few words about that, maybe later during your presentation. But David has also been involved in a documentary which is currently offered for sale. This Land is Our Land. And let's, by way of starting, have a look at the trailer for this documentary.
Patrick Dorey has invented a machine that creates a beach blanket of advertising right in the sand.
Wherever we look today, we see the market reaching into every last corner of our daily lives.
On this 1/2 mile stretch are approximately 5,000 impressions of Skippy peanut butter jars.
Everything's about private property, and everything's for sale.
Everything from the band shell
That will be $125,000.
to the lecture hall
$150,000.
can be named for a price at New Berlin schools.
It's a phenomenon that's reaching some new and even ridiculous extremes.
Even a town selling its own name to an internet company for $75,000. Welcome to Half.com, Oregon.
One frontier after another reduced to private property.
This marks the beginning of the commercial development of the moon, and we suspect we know where it will end as well.
And while it's easy to regard these stories as isolated outrages, they're all symptoms of a deeper, more alarming mentality.
This is the United States of America. It is a highly competitive economy. You claw your way up on the backs of others. That's the way it's done. Didn't you know that?
And over time, we seem to have forgotten a crucial part of our history, the part of the American story that has more to do with our shared interests than with corporate concerns about the bottom line.
We become so spoiled by ready access to good food, quality health care, quality homes, new cars, terrific colleges that we think of them now as things every American is entitled to. But they're not entitlements. They are quality products which are a direct byproduct of our free market.
I'm David Bollier, and I've been studying the Commons for quite some time. And I've discovered that it has a lot to say about the audacious scams of market capitalism. Global markets have been devouring our commons, our shared wealth, for centuries. But fortunately, a movement of people around the world is stepping up to name and reclaim the commons. It's a movement whose time has come.
Okay, thank you for this introduction, and here he is, David Bollier.
Thank you. Well, that film is produced by the Media Education Foundation and was recently screened at the Amherst Cinema and is intended for the higher education market. And we're hoping that that'll get a lot of play in the coming days and months ahead. Well, I'd like to talk today about the rise of the Commons. And the Commons is sort of both an ancient and a modern phenomena that's being reinvented and rediscovered at the same time. It's important to understand that the Commons is not just a buzzword for the common good. It has some specific meanings, as I hope to show in the coming next 45 minutes. The most recent or the most familiar origins of the commons is in English history, especially since the 11th century onward. The commons was a system for managing pastures and forests and wild game. Commoners used it their pigs, which was a crucial source of food, used it to gather acorns, and people used the commons to gather wood for their fires. There was a whole vocabulary around the commons, which is now archaic. But you might say it was kind of a social safety net for people. The etymology of the word comes from the French, which has actually a very beautiful combination of meanings from both the meaning of gift and duty. And I think that encapsulates a lot of what the commons is about. Another important aspect of the commons is what are called enclosures. And this was the period in English history when the landed gentry, the aristocrats, took over, basically stole the commons from the commoners so that it could be used for market purposes. There was an exploding market for wool in the late Middle Ages, and a lot of landed gentry wanted to graze their sheep on the commons, and so essentially they privatized it. It was also a way to consolidate their power. So the story of enclosure is really the story of the disenfranchisement, the violation of the commoners, and it gave rise to all sorts of stories that we're quite familiar with, such as Robin Hood and Charles Dickens's 18th century England, when many commoners who were forced out of their villages had to find a living as wage slaves in London and other big cities. So that's sort of the history that at least the Western world is familiar with the commons. There's many definitions, but the most general one might be said that the commons is everything we inherit or create together, and that we have an obligation to pass on undiminished to future generations. But it's important to understand that the commons are something that are personal and social. It's not just an object, it's something that we connect with in a personal way. So it's not just the way a market culture treats things as objects. People are connected to their commonses. Now, there's a lot of confusion that is attached to the idea of the commons because people use it in different ways. Some people use it as descriptive to say, this is a commons. But then some people use it to say, well, the atmosphere is a commons. But that's really kind of a prescriptive or an aspiration that it be treated or managed as a commons. And then other people use it to try to help make a commons, because if you start talking about a commons, you can, and enough people decide that they want to use that language and to manage a resource as a collective resource, it helps make it a commons. So that's one reason there's some confusion about it, as well as the fact that a commons is social and intersubjective. It's the way people relate to each other in how they manage a resource that makes it a commons. It's not just the fact that it's a physical object like a forest or a fishery or the atmosphere that makes it a commons. This points to the fact that there's three basic elements of a commons. There's the resource itself, there's the distinct community, social community that uses it, and then there's the value and norms and practices by which people manage the resource. So this is one organic whole, and it has to be understood that way. You might say that a commons is a right of action that's bound up with the resource and an identity. And to get back to the word enclosure, enclosure essentially takes apart these things. It takes a shared resource and turns it into a commodity. It takes a social community and takes it into a group of individuals who have nothing to do with each other. And it changes the values and norms of the group into one that might be collective, into one that's oriented around individual buying and selling. That's what market enclosure essentially consists of. Now, it helps to conceptualize the commons in sort of broad categories. There's natural resource commonses. There's a lot of community commons like public libraries and community organizations and farmers markets, things like that. And then there's all sorts of cultural commonses consisting of knowledge and creative sectors and the things we learn at universities, all the different disciplines from that, the internet. This is one way of helping to conceptualize it, because the dynamics of using resources in these different areas can be quite different. Natural resources tend to be depletable, whereas cultural resources can grow and grow and grow, and they don't get used up. The Commons has this medieval history that's very instructive to us today, because it's kind of a template for some of the dynamics going on today. The Magna Carta in the 12th century, the 1200s, was a period in which the commoners reached a armistice with the king after a long civil war to get legal guarantees of the rights that belonged to them. And this was a landmark in human history, because the commoners had formal legal recognition of things that they were entitled to. Many of these basic rights have been incorporated into Western law, especially the U.S. Constitution, such things as due process of law and habeas corpus. But there were also other principles of the right to use the commons and the right to be a steward of the commons that the Magna Carta and an associated document, the Charter of the Forest, helped guarantee. These two books describe, the Magna Carta Manifesto describes that legal history. The World Turned Upside Down describes how there was once a period in the 1600s, from 1640 to 1660, when the commoners, it looked as if they might actually establish a new sort of legal and social order. There was a rebellion against enclosures by groups called the Diggers and the Levelers. Now, the Diggers were those who dug under the hedges or stone fences that had enclosed the commons, and the levelers were the ones who leveled the stone walls. So this was a rebellion of the commoners against the enclosure of things that belonged to all of them. There are a number of other historians, of course, such as E.P. Thompson and Silvia Federici, who deal a lot with the medieval commonses. But in our times, the commons is most associated with the notion of the tragedy of the commons. In the late 1960s, there was a biologist named Garrett Hardin who wrote what became a famous essay called The Tragedy of the Commons in Science magazine. And his essential argument was that left to our own devices, people overexploit the commons. If you have a commons in which you're using sheep, grazing sheep, everyone will have an individual self-interest to put as many sheep as they can on the commons to exploit it as much as they can. And if enough people do that, it will destroy the sustainability, the carrying capacity of that commons. Now, this notion became a truism in American culture, fueled by economists and conservatives who were trying to make the essentially ideological point that the only way to manage a commons is to turn it into private property and to have minimal government supervision of the commons. So in economics for the past generation, it's been taken as self-evident that a commons is a failed management paradigm. It just doesn't work. Of course, this isn't true. And the woman who has probably done the most to help rebut this is Elinor Ostrom, who is an Indiana University professor who recently won the Nobel Prize for Economics for her pioneering work on showing how communities around the world can and have successfully managed their fisheries, their forests, their land, their other grazing lands, their timber resources through collective means. Her studies have been both empirical and very rigorous, as well as analytic in trying to identify the design principles of successful commons. And that's why she won the Nobel Prize for her work. It was a very daring move for the Nobel Prize Committee, because never before had this sort of work been recognized in mainstream economics. She herself is a political scientist with a lot of anthropology and sociology thrown in, but not a straight-up economist the way most winners of that prize are. She helped show that the reason the tragedy of the commons is inaccurate is because in real life, people have all sorts of opportunities to talk with each other, to coordinate with each other, to negotiate and find ways to manage the commons. In other words, you're not just individuals who can't act as a community. Lots of economists set up these so-called prisoner's dilemma experiments that presume that two individuals are locked in separate rooms and can't really communicate and talk, and they always end up having suboptimal outcomes in how they deal with each other. Ostrom's work in the Commons showed that people can and do manage their commons as well. Her influence has been shown in a variety of institutions that persist, such as the Workshop in Political Theory and Policy Analysis and the International Association for the Study of Commons, which is this body of international scholars who study this work. It helps to understand that the natural resource commons and intangible cultural commons have different dynamics. As I mentioned, natural resource commons tend to get used up and can be scarcer than intangible commons like the internet or knowledge, where you can keep adding to it and it won't get used up, and at least in the digital age, you can reproduce knowledge for virtually free. And so the political dynamics of managing these different types of commons can be quite different. It's obviously a little more difficult to manage natural resource commons that get used up, whereas in the intangible commons, it's more about managing how to allocate the resource, how to manage people's contributions to it and curate the knowledge as opposed to managing free riders. On the internet, you can have as many free riders as you want. It won't destroy it. Natural commons tend to work in a different way. Now, I had an epiphany once when I was talking to Elinor Ostrom, because she showed me a slide similar to this, and she said, that's a commons. And this is a shoveled out parking space in Boston, and she explained that in that neighborhood in Boston, there's an understanding that if you dig out shovel out the snow and then put a beat up piece of furniture in it, you're entitled to use that as your parking space for the duration of the snow. And she said, it's a commons because it's a shared understanding of how to allocate a scarce resource. And it was an epiphany for me because it helped show that there's no master inventory of commonses. A commons occurs whenever a community decides that it wants to manage a resource in some collective manner with a special accent on fairness. So it helps to understand that you just can't have a list of 10 or 15 or 100 master commonses. They're all over the place and in different ways. Now, what's happening today is there's an emerging commons movement, both domestically and internationally, of all sorts of different efforts to reclaim shared resources. And I have a list here of just some of the representative examples of people trying to reclaim shared resources that have been enclosed or privatized and marketized by companies. It's one of the more interesting and I think powerful movements going on today, because it's even though it hasn't been recognized by mainstream politics, it's starting to come together. Commoners are starting to find each other and realize that they have a shared identity as victims of the market order, as well as a shared identity in innovating new forms of managing their resources. And one special aspect of this is the reclaiming of local commonses. This is a list of some of the locally oriented movements going on that are trying to reclaim the local food systems and the local economic systems and create alternative currencies and have community-supported agriculture. There's even alternative banks to serve communities that are quite different from conventional banks, and attempts to prevent outside bottlers from claiming local water supplies, which is happening in many communities. So that's a really important aspect of it. But there are many other types of commons. These are just some examples. In Peru, there's some indigenous people that own what is called a potato trust, or they're stewards of the potato trust. A lot of multinational biotech businesses would like to harvest the genetic knowledge of those potatoes, which are quite rare. The indigenous peoples have been designated as the stewards of the potato trust. This other gentleman here is helped revive a number of rivers in India by having communities become engaged with conserving water and dealing with the ecosystem. And eventually they brought back the rivers so that it could be a sustainable source of irrigation and drinking water for the community. Here are some microbes. There's a microbial commons where scientists are collectively getting together to manage their knowledge about different microbial phenomena and research. There's the phenomena of couch surfing, which many young people are familiar with, which is an international gift economy of people who host travelers, all of it mediated by the internet. And there's no money exchanged. It's simply a social goodwill community where you can go to hundreds of different cities around the world and get a free sofa to sleep on overnight. Gilberto Gil was the former Minister of Culture in Brazil. Brazil is the major free culture nation which as a government is committed to free software and the use of Creative Commons licenses in all sorts of its research and cultural products. And then the Heritable Innovation Trust is something that has been devised by indigenous peoples to help them control their native knowledge, ethnobotanical knowledge, and sometimes sacred knowledge from outside appropriators, often companies that want to turn that into marketable product. So I just wanted to give you a sense of really the breadth and variety of different types of commons around the world. It helps to understand that the commons is really kind of a new conceptualization and a new language. And if you want to get kind of academic about it, a new ontology or epistemology. And by that it means a new way of being, a new way of relating to each other, a new way of relating to nature than the market order does. It's also different categories of knowledge, new ways of understanding how we understand the world. And it all comes down to talking about value and how it's generated. If you happen to be an economist, you have your own ideas about how wealth is created. It's created when individuals exchange money in the marketplace and measurable wealth and new products are created. Well, the commons has a different notion of how value is created. It's about the value that's created through social interactions, and it's not necessarily a saleable product. And this is sometimes hard for traditionalists to understand. I write about some of this in a recent book, Viral Spiral, How the Commoners Built a Digital Republic of Their Own. And it's about how in the digital world, on the internet, lots of people have been creating their own commons outside of the market order, outside of government, in a way that is starting to compete with markets, or some would say out-cooperate markets. Examples are such things as the free software Linux, the operating system, and in fact there are thousands of different free and open source software programs built by communities by themselves. There's also the Creative Commons licenses, which allow people to share knowledge. I'll get to that in a few minutes. And then there's a whole variety of online commons, from Wikipedia to collaborative websites and archives. I'll be naming some of them here. All of these commons challenge the traditional view that the public domain is a dusty attic full of junk. The reason that copyright traditionalists have viewed the public domain as worthless is because if it had any value, of course, it would have a price tag. And the public domain doesn't have a price tag. And so they regarded it as not something worth considering. The person who probably first challenged this idea was Richard Stallman, who was a legendary hacker at MIT in the 1980s. And he developed what is now known as free software. He was disturbed that his hacker community was eroding, disappearing, as everybody trooped off to create proprietary software for companies to sell it in the market. And he wanted to assure that a community of hackers or programmers could continue to own their self-created product without it being appropriated by the market. And to do that, he created what's called the general public license. which is a license that is asserted by somebody with a copyright to a software program. And what the GPL does is it inverts, turns inside out the whole notion of copyright. Normally when things are created, they're automatically in an envelope of private property rights. And they're born as a market product, so to speak. He took, the general public license says, I am giving you advance permission to do whatever you want with this program. You can make copies, you can do derivative works of it, you can share it, but whatever you create also has to be shareable by other people. And so this is sort of a viral legal mechanism to make something shareable in perpetuity. And it, as I say, it turns copyright inside out. And this was the primary reason that Linux and other open source software programs were able to exist, because otherwise a company would just take the product, take the program and say, we're going to copyright it for ourselves and make money off of it. The GPL helped assure that there could be a software commons, and this proved to be a very seminal innovation in law and social practice. It was later followed up by Professor Lawrence Lessig of Harvard University, who, with a number of artists and computer programmers and lawyers, devised what's known as the Creative Commons licenses. It was directly inspired by the GPL, and what it does is it enables you as the copyright owner of a text or a video or a photograph or a piece of music to put the license on and say, this work can be shared by anyone without my advance permission or needing payment, so long as you meet certain conditions. And there are 6 basic licenses. So one of the conditions might be, you can do whatever you want with this work so long as you give me credit, give me attribution, or so long as you don't use it for commercial purposes. It can be only non-commercial. Or so long as you don't make derivative works of it. Say photographers don't want their work to be chopped up in some way or cropped in a different way. So these licenses were a critical innovation for creating digital commonses because they allowed things to be legally shared, which otherwise would have been legally problematic, if not outright illegal. Because as I pointed out, on the internet, or in everywhere, things are born within an envelope of property rights. So what's happened is we now have a new infrastructure for building and protecting commons online. We have the technological open platforms and software. We have the legal licenses that I just mentioned. And then we're developing social practices where the community decides what rules and values are going to be observed by the people in that commons. And this has been one of the most significant social innovations of the past 15 years, that a commons can begin to manage resources in a way that neither markets nor governments can do. But it also raises the question, how shall we govern the commons? What will be the rules? What's the theories for how a commons will be governed online? Well, it's here where Elinor Ostrom's work helps give us some guidance, because she has pointed out that commons fail for these reasons, where if there's free riders, or which is not so applicable online, but in the online world it does matter if there's vandals or trolls, people who are disrupting the community. A commons will fail if there's no rules or ineffective rules, or if there's poor boundaries defining the community. And it's very helpful to have a shared culture for a commons. So, for example, Wikipedia, if you're a contributing member or editor of Wikipedia, you become part of that community and its ways of doing things. And the same with many other types of online communities, whether it's building software or a fan community based on certain comic books. All sorts of different commons is out there. But one general rule that I've put forward is that which is created in the commons must stay within the commons unless the commoners themselves decide otherwise. And this is an essential rule for making sure that the commons is not destroyed through the appropriation of people's work. And that requires both the social rules as well as sometimes legal rules for protecting the fruits of the commons. Unfortunately, the story of our time is the enclosure of the commons. And by that, just to remind you, it means the privatization and the commodification of resources that we share. Resources that maybe weren't turned into money before, but now can be bought and sold on the market. The enclosure also means what you might call the decontextualization. You're sort of ripping it out of its local context so that it can just be a fungible object, can be bought and sold anywhere. And you're just dispossessing the community that created that resource. And I want to give you a brief tour of enclosure of our times, because it really is one of the great unacknowledged scandals of our time. The global atmosphere, climate change, is really a direct result of enclosure, with companies regarding the shared global atmosphere as a free waste dump for themselves. The human genome, 20% of it is now privately patented. Again, something that ought to be a shared resource of all of humanity is being privatized. Fresh water, many multinational bottling companies are taking groundwater supplies and seizing possession of them, turning it into branded product, destroying the local ecosystem in the process. And there's many, many other examples that I cite here. My book, Silent Theft, The Private Plunder of Our Common Wealth, in 2002 was my first encounter with this, where I documented the broad spectrum of different arenas in which our shared resources are being privatized. Everything from our public lands, where oil and gold and grazing rights are given away for a song, sometimes for free, to federal drug research and federal information resources, often just given away for free to private companies to resell, or pioneering drug research, which drug companies then do a modest amount of additional research or clinical testing and then sell at exorbitant prices under exclusive licenses. Again, the knowledge that we helped create, privatized. I followed this up in the year 2005 with a book, brand name Bullies, The Quest to Own and Control Culture, which was a survey of how copyright and trademark law is privatizing a lot of our shared creativity and culture. And I'll give you a few examples of this. This is an art installation by the artist Heidi Code called American Alphabet. And she wanted to note how the corporate world has been privatizing letters of the alphabet as corporate logos. And you probably can identify a few here, from the C of Campbell's Soup to the O of Oreos to the M of M&M's to the P of Pez Candy. She was trying to make a point of how the corporate appropriation of culture is really reaching into some very deep nooks and crannies of our life. Barbie. Mattel is one of the most notorious and aggressive brand name bullies in an effort to protect its trademark. This photo called Barbie Enchilada was part of a photo exhibit where this photographer had put Barbie in a number of unflattering or sexual or kitchen positions and was making fun of Barbie. And Mattel sued the photographer, and what was unusual about this case, instead of just capitulating and saying, you win, I'll shut down my exhibit, he found legal representation and took it to the Ninth Circuit Court, a federal court, and won, after his law firm had spent $2 million defending him. But for the first time, Mattel had to observe some limits in how it could crack down on protecting its trademark. Now, the ultimate irony is that Mattel had appropriated the whole image of Barbie from this German novelty doll called Lily. In other words, it hadn't been the innovator, yet it was claiming private property rights through trademark in Barbie, and trying to control how we could even comment on Barbie as a public image. Mattel has even gone after book titles that use Barbie, especially when it's related to food disorders, eating disorders. There was a book that was once, the publisher was forced to change the title because they used Barbie to talk about eating disorders. There's even an effort to try to own letters and words. McDonald's goes after any restaurant that uses Mick in its title, like McSushi or McDharma. And the irony is that you have a San Diego-based company claiming private ownership of a Scottish-Irish prefix. The U.S. Olympic Committee actually has a statutory congressional right to the word Olympics. And so the Olympic Committee has allowed Special Olympics, but you can't use the word Olympics as in gay Olympics. So it's a privately owned word, you might say, just as there's a Japanese company that owns the phoneme Zilla, as in Godzilla, and has gone after a website named davezilla.com. This certificate is from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. A former UMass graduate student, Kembrew McLeod, applied for and got a trademark in the phrase freedom of expression. And he was kind of a prankster who was trying to make a point. But he officially has a trademark in that term. The punchline comes when AT&T once developed a marketing plan called Freedom of Expression, and Kembrew sent a cease and desist letter to AT&T to say, you're using my trademark. And of course, they just laughed because they knew he had no legal resources to defend his right, and his point had been made. Now, a lot of these examples are about, of course, the over-propertization of culture, but the internet is turning this inside out because it's calling into question the value of private property online. It's not so easy to defend private property rights online. In my book, Viral Spiral, I call this the great value shift. And it's all about how open platforms are enabling this explosion of user-driven creativity. And the question that arises is there greater value generated by keeping the content exclusive, by claiming it as private property, or by sharing it? A friend of mine once said that the only thing worse than being sampled on the internet is not being sampled. In other words, much more value is being created by just putting yourself out there without having strict copyright control over your work, because more people can find it and you can make money through other means than simply owning it as private property. Now, the question is also raised on the internet about control and governance. Problems are becoming so complex and dynamic and local that centralized institutions like Hollywood, the record industry, and even government, they have trouble managing things these days. They're not as responsive as networks. And capital-driven markets have their own priorities and difficulties in managing resources. But online commons as socially driven networks are often proving to be very effective, efficient alternatives, not to mention socially satisfying alternatives. So there's some interesting tensions being raised here. I was once at a conference where the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, was saying that the U.S. State Department has great difficulty competing with a lot of online networks because the networks can get information and process it more quickly, and it's often closer, more on the ground and reliable information than a centralized bureaucracy like the State Department that has to winnow the information as it moves upstream. So there's this interesting tension between networks and commons and traditional forms of government. The other revelation about the internet commons is that the commons is generative. It's not a tragedy. And you can see this in the variety of different types of value creation, you might say, from free software to remix music, video mashups, amateur videos, photo sharing on Flickr, Craigslist, many, many other things. And this is the new phenomena in economics and social life, that the commons is creating things in ways that defy conventional economics. In fact, I think it's so prolific that I call it the commons sector. And these are the logos of some of the more prominent online commons: Wikipedia, free software, Creative Commons, Flickr, Internet Archive, many, many others. It's a phenomenon that's yet to be reckoned with theoretically. It's a very under-theorized, not terribly well understood world. But one of the common denominators is that socially created value is becoming a macroeconomic and cultural force in its own right. The social worlds are creating things that companies couldn't begin to create with their budgets. It's been estimated, for example, that Linux would cost $5 billion to create these days. And of course, it was created entirely for free or as a free resource without any corporate apparatus managing it. Even though oftentimes employees might have a role in helping to create it, it's not a corporate entity. Clay Shirky, who's an NYU professor, has said that there's a huge cognitive surplus. We're creating lots of knowledge and culture. The question is it going to be privatized and made artificially scarce through copyright and trademark, or is it going to be managed as a shared resource in the commons? That's really the question for our times. And as I said, this phenomena is empowering individuals and commons to bypass centralized institutions and credentialed authorities and experts. And so in all sorts of fields, from politics to television to education to government to journalism, the centralized institutions are being besieged by talented amateurs, networks, and commons that have different ways of creating the same sorts of value that these large centralized industries used to create in different ways. The other phenomena is that the sharing economy is going global, and this is really quite striking. There are now more than 50 countries around the world that use Creative Commons licenses, or in which the licenses have been adapted to the legal jurisdictions, the special kinds of law, which means that there's now an international community of people who are sharing things with Creative Commons licenses. Everything from academic knowledge to videos to collaborative archives to the blog world. And there's the rise of what I call transnational digital tribes, where people are no longer necessarily identifying with their national citizenship, but with these transnational communities of people who perhaps remix music, or communities of bloggers who share an interest in the same topic, or in academia, something called open access scholarly publishing, where people share works that don't have, that use Creative Commons licenses, and so the work can be legally shared without the usual restrictions of copyright law. I don't have time to get into all of these, but there's also transnational phenomena of open business models, where instead of holding tightly to copyrighted control of works, there are people who are making money, profits, from open platforms on the internet. Very innovative types of models. Open educational resources. MIT has pioneered something called open courseware, where the curriculum is put online for free. And so everything that's in the syllabus can be accessed by outsiders for free. There's now more than 120 colleges and universities around the world that share their curricular materials in this way. And then there's an offshoot of the Creative Commons called the Science Commons, which is enabling scientists to share their data and research more readily. It's a longer, more complicated story, but it's very difficult for much highly specialized scientific research to be shared for both copyright as well as software and technical reasons. So Science Commons is facilitating that. But one bottom line of all this larger trend is that the commons is becoming a new species of citizenship, or you might say more accurately, commoning, meaning the commons is not just a noun but a verb, the social practices of how we share things. And it's a new ethic, really, that is starting to slip over into our politics. Because in the online world, there's a lot of attributes that people have in which they honor open access and self-organized participation. They want things to be clear and transparent and not secretive. Talent and innovation is recognized, and so forth. Well, a lot of people love this about the online world, and it's arguably more democratic and wholesome than our official democracy. So many people are trying to bring some of the virtues of the online world to our real-life democracy. It's one reason why Lawrence Lessig, the founder of the Creative Commons licenses, is now trying to deal with the corruption of public policy and try to make our official democracy as open and accessible and participatory as the online world. It comes down to the commons is really becoming a new kind of social organism and metabolism for how we govern things and the kind of law that we impose on things. It's not necessarily a law Congress enacts. It could be a law that a community establishes itself and socially enforces. However it comes to be, commons is starting to have serious economic and cultural impact that we really need to start taking account of. And I see that there's really a convergence of diverse commonses into a new archetype of change. This was seen dramatically at the International Commons Conference that was held in Berlin just a couple of weeks ago. And it was called Constructing a Commons-Based Policy Platform. And we had about 200 self-styled commoners from about 35 countries. Everybody from urban spaces activists in Croatia, to cattle grazers in India, to free software hackers from Amsterdam, and digital activists and commoners in Brazil. Just a wild mix of commoners who all agreed that the commons is a way that their respective efforts are related. And the commons to each of them provides a way for understanding how the neoliberal market order is essentially victimizing them, violating their right to control shared resources. So I'm expecting a lot of fascinating collaborations and new ideas to come out of this conference, and there's already talk of hosting another one in the next year on a larger scale than that one. Myself, I'm working on something called the Commons Law Project. I'm working with a colleague, Professor Burns Weston, who's an international law and human rights scholar, to see if we can recover from history a whole body of commons-based law that has essentially been forgotten or eclipsed, and to show how there are some common principles in this arc stretching over centuries, and how this legal body of law might be a foundation for the new commons movement that's arising today. Just as the civil rights movement or the women's movement has always cited some basic legal principles as the moral and legal foundation for their activism, the commons movement needs this body of law to show that there is this rich history justifying the kinds of things they're struggling for. Commons-based strategies might be boiled down to a handful of principles, in that we want policies and systems that honor commoning, the social practice of being stewards of shared resources. And you want to have policies that can respect the commons as it is, as a non-market resource. Commons is valuable sometimes precisely because it hasn't been turned into a market resource. So the commoners need to be able to protect that different kind of value. And then the commoners need to build defensible boundaries around their commons, and they need to be able to what used to be called beating the bounds. In the medieval commons, there was an annual party where people would walk around the perimeter of their commons and see if anybody had enclosed parts of it by putting up fences. And they would knock down the fences, and it was sort of this celebratory event that also helped protect the shared resource. Well, we need to find the modern day equivalents for beating the bounds of our commons today, whether it's the human genome or the atmosphere or our local communities' open spaces. And then we need to, these different commons need to start to connect to each other so that we can develop a new ecosystem of mutually supportive commons so we can begin to capture and leverage all the wealth that's being created by them. As one might gather, this is a work in progress. There's a lot of answers that we don't have yet, a lot of answers that have to be invented and innovated. But I can also say there are dozens of highly innovative social mechanisms, policy mechanisms that are being devised by commoners around the world. And so our challenge, I think, is to start to connect the dots between them and start to build on them a whole new sector that really has a lot of constructive potential in this time of often dismal, pessimistic politics in which our democracy is quite weak. In that sense, the Commons is a way to, I think, help reconstruct and reinvent civil society and democratic practice, which is in very severe state of decline. So I thank you for letting me present these ideas, and I'd love to have a conversation with you if you have any questions or comments about my talk.
Thank you, David. This was quite an interesting and comprehensive overview. I recommend you for being so broad-minded and broad-focused. But if I may play the devil's advocate here, you've also pointed out some of the weaknesses and the problems related to this kind of futuristic perspective. There's still a brave new world, but an ugly world out there. Capitalism hasn't really given up all its activities and all its values, to use one of your terms. So there are people who consider this to be a bit of a sideshow, like we have had other sideshows in the past, and you made reference to some of those, but if we just stay within the past 50 years, we've had the 60s movements and the couple of related kind of activities. And those people, they might also say, because the internet and everything digital and online is being appreciated and regarded as maybe an alternative and a space where more can be experimented with, etc. But those same people, they say, look at Facebook, look at Google, two of the operations which are definitely all around and used by most of us, I guess. They are not public domain, they are private domain, and we have really accepted that as something like a new business model. So I'm trying to get some discussion going here. How do you respond to this?
A lot of open platforms like Facebook or Google are essentially faux commons or false commons in that they rely upon social communities as part of their business model, but then try to appropriate as much as they can from the community, often in very antisocial ways. Facebook, of course, is famous for data mining the privacy of people. And it's important to understand that the digital world in its entirety is not necessarily a commons, and there are a lot of businesses that are quite distinct. That said, these business models can only be so antisocial before people start to flee to our alternatives. And in fact, there's already a privacy-friendly alternative to Facebook called Diaspora that's being developed. And it could prove to be a serious competitor over the long haul if Facebook continues to be as disrespectful of its participants. The larger point is that for the first time in history, the media platform can be protected from the capitalist appropriation and co-optation. It's not to say that this is a predetermined story, it's just that people have the legal tools and the software infrastructure to build a different cultural space than historically we've been able to build. And so I find that a very hopeful phenomena. But you're absolutely right. The commons has not burst onto the mainstream. Some people will say it will just continue to be a sideshow. While it is embryonic and somewhat small in an absolute sense, the diversity, the range of participation, and the power that some of them have actually shown suggests to me that it's really has a lot of long-term potential, especially in a time when the mainstream neoliberal economic model is in disarray, crisis, has been discredited in many respects, and people are searching for alternatives with greater social that are more socially respectful and constructive and more ecologically
Right.
respectful. So there's a lot to be done. It's not a predetermined outcome.
It's work in progress, as
Yes.
you mentioned. But to bring it back to one of the points you made, the building up, the creation of this new quote-unquote infrastructure implies at least three components: the technology, the legal infrastructure and components, as well as socially created values. Now, I take it that these three have to work together in order to trigger change, right?
Yes, and that's part of the interesting experimentation going on. For example, there's some people who are trying to reinvent money.
Mm-hmm.
Why should credit be privately controlled by banks? Why shouldn't communities have more absolute control over it? And so people are trying to use digital tools with legal tools, with social practices in communities to devise new forms of money. That's what I find so compelling about the commons, is that once people can get sufficient ownership and protection of their shared resources, that's a real beachhead to build upon. And in some ways, it's, even though it's small, it's more powerful than some of the inconclusive efforts to try to win things from Washington, where it's an open secret that it's a corrupted system. So where do you want to place your energies? On a corrupted system? Hey, I'm very glad a lot of people are in there trying to do God's work there. But on the other hand, it's nice to have a foundation that you think might be a stronger base over time. And so that's where I personally have decided to place a lot of my energies.
No, and that's hopefully also for good reasons. But of course, people have to make the decision on their own situation. And although there is a need for a change in values, the monetary value, the material value is definitely still important to survive and to create a living in our kind of world. So if we take it that that new value has to be introduced in a parallel way and eventually is going to compete with the more traditional values of society, how do you envision that to take place? Of course, if we look at Marxism, there has always been the emphasis on the basic economic values.
Right.
The infrastructure has to be determined, and then later we can try playing with great ideas like Creative Commons. So where is this going to happen in this new configuration?
Well, I think one frontier is devising interesting new ways in which the market and commons can work together. I don't see the commons as being anti-market necessarily. It's more about developing a respectful synergy with it. And we see that free software has figured, and open source software has figured that out. IBM earns more money from its Linux-based services and support than it does from its patent portfolio. So, and IBM was one of the early investors in Linux, even though it couldn't even own the product. So that's one example where it's occurred. But in a lot of other cultural sectors like music and film and the rest, people are still trying to figure out, well, how can we make money but still let the creativity flow in a commons and not destroy the commons by over-propertizing it? Mm-hmm. The same with drug research. Drug companies are starting to learn that they can't own all of it and still have the creativity of the research. They need to have a shared research commons and lots of collaboration for it to work. But of course, they're in the business of making money for shareholders. Right. So they're trying to negotiate how a commons and market can be compatible. One of the more interesting things is that many commoners see the commons as something to fight capitalism. Others are simply like, some capitalists see the commons as a way to improve capitalism. So there's different philosophical approaches.
Right. And there will be a need for and a space for negotiations, I guess.
Yes, yes.
Okay, maybe it's time for us to open up the floor and invite some questions or comments.
Really fascinating. I come from an education background, and I was struck by what you were talking about with like the MIT courseware and that sort of thing. And I feel like you've elaborated on this just in your discussion with Jan about this kind of collaboration between capitalism and the commons, because it's, I'm perhaps a little cynical about, MIT's motives for sharing that courseware, because it's not really free, is it? It's coming from an organization that has a lot of private funding and corporate funding that goes into it, and that is part of the privatized education sector. And so while this seemingly free courseware is coming out, it may be of value, at a information level. But I feel like it's still, we were just discussing this in one of my classes a few days ago, it's still of no monetary value in this capitalist economy unless you have that piece of paper from MIT. And then that information has value. It also has, in a sense, it has value for the institution, because it becomes, in a sense, a part of their marketing package. So I'm just a little bit...
Well, you're right to point out all those complexities, but let me add some more complexities. MIT decided that they would not be able to make it a hugely lucrative market to sell its courses, and that it would get more value through public recognition and branding, as you say. That said, the MIT courses have been immensely valuable, especially in the developing world, where MIT physics in China has created a whole new benchmark of how people are taught there. And this has indeed been free, even though MIT, of course, gets benefits from it all. But this points up the interesting migration to how value is recognized. The value is not necessarily monetized private value, it's social value that is kind of confounding to traditional economists. And it's something, though, I think we need to get used to, because value is going to be sort of hovering in the air, and it might be reputational value as opposed to cash take to the bank value. But I guess I don't have quarrels with that, in that to the extent that reputation can't just be bought or sold but has to be earned, that's, I think, a positive thing. And you see that in a lot of internet communities where the product is not a product, it's something that is organically connected to the community and its individuals. And so it's a different framework for value that we're still trying to come to terms with. It has elements of the market, it has elements of the commons.
Yeah, I think it's also important, as you pointed out, to distinguish between primary and secondary values, and those primary values may be the intended values or objectives of the producer or the MIT in this case, but what we get out of it might be the unintended aspects of what is being distributed.
Or the economists call it positive externalities. And instead of all those positive externalities being entirely appropriated by the industry, there's plenty to share, or in fact sharing it will increase their market gains. And this is the counterintuitive thing. When the New York Times had Time Select, in which they put all their columnists behind a paywall, the influence and value of those columnists plummeted. And the same, you may have seen the newspapers recently, the Zagat's restaurant guide put themselves behind a paywall, and were outcompeted on the internet by companies who allowed free access. So there's different business models if you're focused on business models, and those commoners say, hey, let's develop commons-based models and forget about trying to monetize it all.
Right.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Sorry, just because it still relates to the generation of information. And again, sort of going back to the MIT example, I think the other thing, and I in principle, I completely agree with the comments, but coming from the South and from a developing country context, I guess what also concerns me about just the generation of information and the legitimization of knowledge, or rather of information, again, even this sort of free, open sharing of information from institutions like MIT, I feel like it adds to this weight of the North, as the generators and the holders of knowledge, and then that is disseminated to the people who maybe don't have as much access, who don't have as much legitimacy. And I think with the internet, definitely in the United States and Europe and much of the north of the world, that's where the equipment, and the technology has developed, and therefore that voice is heard, that knowledge is legitimized through the medium much more than it is in the South. And I just wondered if you'd be able to speak to that.
In other words, is this another form of cultural imperialism?
I think if anything, the direction is shifting. And to the extent that English is increasingly waning as the dominant language of the internet, especially as China goes online. And a lot of indigenous knowledge and creativity is burbling up on national internet platforms in a way that I think, if anything, gives greater opportunities for cultural sovereignty rather than colonialism from the North. And to the extent that Northern research, for example, can be shared with the South for free through open access, that's a straight up absolute boon. But there's instances where people from uncredentialed or lesser known universities are participating in disciplines where previously if you weren't at Harvard, MIT, or Carnegie Mellon, nobody would listen to you. In physics especially, there's a collaborative website where instead of going through the journals and that bottleneck of peer credentials, there's a much wider participation. So it's we're still in a transition. I think that some of the dynamics you cited still exist, but I think the long-term dynamic is for greater cultural autonomy around the world.
Song and then another one.
I want to mention another buzzword is the Web 2.0. I'm wondering whether you consider the commons as an organic component of the Web 2.0 or that's completely different kind of words. The concept or different kinds of concept.
The Web 2.0, meaning open platforms that allow interactive social engagement, don't necessarily have to be a commons, and as we talked about, Facebook can be a privately owned platform where the terms of service, the contract, govern how people interact on it. So the Web 2.0 technological infrastructure certainly has been an enabler, a powerful enabler of commons, but it's also been an enabler of new business models. So how that's going to shake out over the long term, whether the commons will be able to defend itself, whether it'll be marginalized, is an open question. But it's also clear that we're not going to have just the traditional businesses that can be antisocial and disrespectful of communities, because that's just not a viable business proposition anymore.
Okay, one more question there.
You've spoken of the commons as often a public space or something held by communities. I'm wondering if you've also spoken of the false commons of social networking sites that use data mining.
Mm-hmm.
That makes me wonder about any way that you or commoners might look at private spaces and privacy rights in terms of a commons perspective, kind of paradoxically.
Well, I mean, in some ways, it gets very interesting where a local coffee shop might be privately owned, but be a social commons for a community. So to the extent that privately owned commons is not eavesdropping on your conversations or being manipulative of the social community, that's a relatively benign melding of a privately owned resource and a social commons. I think there's a lot of these kind of instances, and it's rare to have a pure commons or even a pure market, because the market can't function without the commons, be it a riverway or the roads. So it's more, I think, the terms by which the commons and the market interact that determines whether it's benign or exploitative.
Any more questions, please?
Yeah, maybe a theoretical question. I'm wondering, according to your research, is there any other cultures, tradition or rules you can use to support the idea of commons? Oh, the commons is just an idea from the Western, especially Great Britain tradition?
It has a lot of international resonance, but because the cultural context is often so different, people will approach it in very different ways. We in the industrialized countries might have a more benign sense of government. If you go to Latin America or developing countries, they consider governments corrupt and having no legitimate role in protecting the commons or being a trustee of the commons. And a lot of indigenous cultures can't conceive of the idea of public policy or bureaucracies being in any way involved with commons. And so the baseline assumptions of your culture often affect how you regard the commons, which can be confusing unless you just accept the idea that a commons is like a fractal system where there are some maybe resemblances between them, but there's not a universal grid of explanation the way, let's just say, the 20th century mind might conceive it. In other words, the true diversity of the human species can be represented in all sorts of ways, but they can still be commonses. This is sometimes hard to get your mind around, but in some ways you could say that's the story of the internet. The so-called TCP/IP protocol, which allows different networks to intercommunicate, it's like a shared protocol, yet highly diverse networks that can interact. That's kind of the paradigm that I see for the commons as a global phenomena.
So in other words, there may be a multiplicity of different commons.
Absolutely,
everywhere
absolutely.
Available, and in this country and in this culture it might have a basic emphasis on freedom and
that was the story,
these kind of issues.
That was the lesson I learned at the Berlin conference too, where people from highly diverse backgrounds were arguing about, well, this is the commons, no, that's the commons, and I think that's a very productive long-term discussion for the human species to have in this time when we're so interdependent but hardly recognize how interdependent we are.
Indeed. And that's probably also a good way to conclude this session. Thank you for your food for thought, and thank you for your interest.